What if the greatest enemy of your identity is the way you try to achieve it? Jacob didn't want to destroy anyone. He just wanted to be someone. From the womb, he fought for a place. But what do you do when your soul craves affirmation, and all you've ever known is deception? He deceived, but he was also shaped by expectations that confused him. He ran, but not because he was a coward, rather because he didn't know who he was. With someone else's blessing, he ran through deserts carrying a name he didn't understand. And when he finally stopped, heaven leaned down. A ladder, a vision, a promise, and a God who visits those no one else would forgive. This story doesn't begin with repentance. It begins with running, but it ends with transformation. And maybe, so will yours. I'm Peniel, and you're watching Shadows of Scripture. Today, you'll walk with me through Jacob's journey, a man who tried to gain through cunning what would only be his by grace. But first, subscribe to this channel, because what you're about to hear isn't just a memory, it's a spiritual key. Some stories are born out of peace, others out of chaos, but there are also those that are born from God's choice. And almost always, those are the most painful ones. Jacob wasn't a twist of fate. He was conceived amid promises, but also amid tensions. His father Isaac was the heir of the promise made to Abraham, a man of faith, but also of silence. His mother, Rebekah, was a woman marked by answered prayers, but with a womb that remained barren for years. The birth of the children was a miracle, but what began as a divine answer soon revealed itself as a battlefield of spiritual war. From the very beginning, there was something unusual. Rebekah felt a violent stirring within her, movements that didn't feel natural, kicks that weren't just from growth. It was as if something inside the womb refused to wait for birth. And in distress, she sought the Lord. The answer she received was strange, even frightening. Our two nations are in your womb. Two peoples will be separated from within you. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Right there, in the most intimate place of human creation, the mother's womb, God himself had established a principle that would echo through the ages. The first is not always the chosen one. The strongest is not always the one who receives the blessing. God's plan doesn't always follow man's logic. Jacob was born into this tension. He wasn't being formed merely as an individual. He was the beginning of a divine reversal, a living reminder that God chooses whom he wills. And often his choice is born out of human conflict. And when the day of delivery came, the scene was full of symbols. Esau came out first. Strong, red, hairy, a baby who, at first glance, already looked ready for the world. But immediately a hand appeared, grabbing his heel. It wasn't just a biological reflex. It was a silent statement. Jacob was holding his brother, not playfully, but instinctively, as if saying, I refuse to be left behind. I refuse to be second. I must reach. That image, so brief and so overlooked by many, would become the mirror of Jacob's soul for many years. A man who would spend his life trying to forcefully take hold of what heaven had already promised. A man whose heart would never settle for being just someone ordinary. But what the name reveals, it also exposes Jacob, the one who grabs the heel, the supplanter, the one who tries to advance by his own means, the one who lives trying to prove himself. This is where many spiritual journeys find themselves in his story. How many today live with that same inner tension between a sincere desire to please God and the human urge to control everything? How many, like Jacob, were marked by prophetic words even in the womb, but grew up bearing the weight of not knowing who they really are? Jacob didn't choose to be born fighting, but that fight marked him. And this teaches us something crucial. There are battles you didn't start, but they will define who you become. Jacob's first impression of the world was his brother's heel, and maybe that's why he spent much of his life looking ahead, trying to catch up, trying to be seen, trying to be worthy. But identity before God isn't built through effort. It's revealed through transformation. Growing up in the shadow of a brother like Esau wasn't just a matter of comparison. It was a constant identity crisis. Esau was everything the culture of that time valued. A hunter, strong, decisive, visceral. From an early age, he took the place of his father's favorite. Isaac admired him for what he could see. The strength of his arms, the scent of the field, the skill with weapons. The firstborn son, the symbol of continuity and inheritance. The heir to the natural blessing. But what about Jacob? Jacob was quiet. A homebody. An observer. His feet weren't in the fields, but among pots, words, and silences. He didn't hunt animals, he cooked. And in a time when masculinity was synonymous with physical strength, that made him almost invisible. Except to one person, Rebekah. If Isaac had a favorite son, Rebekah did too. Jacob was the reflection of what she perceived spiritually. Maybe he reminded her of the prophetic answer she had received during pregnancy. Maybe she felt deep in her soul that God had chosen the younger one, even if no one else believed it. But the problem is that when a spiritual gift mixes with emotional pain, the result is manipulation disguised as care. Rebekah began to protect Jacob, to guide him, to teach him, but also to project onto him an expectation that over time became a burden. Jacob grew up between two tensions, his father's quiet rejection and his mother's intense gaze, one looking for something in him that wasn't there, the other shaping something in him that didn't yet exist. This family dynamic distorted something essential: identity. Jacob no longer knew who he was supposed to be. He wasn't like Esau, but he also couldn't just be himself. And that created a void, the kind of void that makes us seek approval where there is no love, the kind of pain that makes us put on masks. Because in order to survive, Jacob learned to perform. He knew what his father expected. He knew what his mother desired. He knew what the culture demanded. And to avoid being rejected by all of them, he started adapting to each one. With Rebekah, he was the sensitive, attentive, chosen son. When he needed Isaac's blessing, he became Esau. This detail is crucial, because the moment Jacob disguised himself as his brother to deceive his father, it wasn't an isolated act. It was the climax of years living in the shadow of others' expectations. Maybe what hurts the most in this part of the story is the fact that Jacob didn't want to usurp for pleasure. He just wanted to be accepted. He just wanted to hear from his father's mouth what every son longs to hear. You are mine. I bless you. You have value. But when that doesn't come naturally, the soul begins to hide. And it's in that hiding place that deception is born. How many live like this today? Disguised, doing everything to appear spiritually strong, emotionally stable, socially accepted. But inside, they carry Jacob's same pain. If I am truly myself, would anyone still bless me? The pain of not being seen by the one you love most. The tension of always trying to fit in. The fear of never being enough. That was Jacob's heart. A heart shaped not only by mistakes, but by the absence of affirmation. And when blessing becomes a goal to be achieved through performance, deception becomes a tempting path. But God saw. God always saw. And at the right time, he would intervene. The day came. Isaac was old, his eyes nearly blind, his soul in a hurry to seal the future with words of blessing. Esau, the favored son, was called. The instruction was simple. Bring me game, prepare the food I like, and I will bless you before I die. But someone was listening by the door. Rebekah heard, and her soul, moved for years by prophetic zeal, turned into strategy. She ran to Jacob, and the plan was drawn. Prepare a dish like Esau's. Dress in your brother's clothes. Cover your arms with goatskin. The father, without sight, would rely on smell, touch, taste. Not discernment. Jacob hesitated. What if he touches me? He knew the risk. He knew it wasn't right. But he also knew that blessing was everything he wanted. To be blessed, to be recognized, to be named. So he went, wearing his brother's clothes, with his brother's skin, with his brother's food, but with a soul. Empty. The moment is tense. Genesis chapter 27 records the dialogue. Isaac is suspicious. How did you get back so quickly? "Yes, my father. Are you really my son Esau?" "I am." Jacob's words cut through the room like blades. And in that moment, the deception wasn't just an external act. It was a spiritual rupture, because he didn't just lie. He assumed an identity that wasn't his, to try to receive from God something that had already been promised to him. And here, I, Iliam, need to say something I feel in my spirit. This is the drama of many spiritual hearts today. People who know they've been called, but because they don't understand the timing and the process, they disguise themselves to try to rush the promise. They act like others, talk like others, copy models, because they fear they won't be blessed for who they really are. Isaac blesses him. Yes, the blessing is released, but not without consequence. Minutes later, Esau walks in, and the world collapses. Isaac trembles. He cries out. Esau weeps. And Jacob runs. This is where the story shifts tone, because what was gained through cunning now requires escape. Jacob runs with no time to celebrate. No identity, no home, no peace. Carrying the blessing in his hands and the weight of guilt in his heart. This is the point where heaven goes silent but doesn't give up, because God knew. God always knew that this wounded boy would still become Israel. Jacob ran, but the ground was also running beneath his feet. With every step, the blessing grew heavier. And it wasn't the blessing itself, but the way it was obtained. He was no longer just a brother. He was a traitor, a fugitive, a man with promises in his name, but shame on his shoulders. The desert stretched out before him like a mirror, empty, arid, harsh, the kind of place where the soul is exposed, where the external noise fades and the inner voices scream. The Bible says that at nightfall, Jacob stopped at a place called Luz. No tent, no company, no plan. He picked up a stone and laid it as a pillow. This image always makes me pause for a few seconds, because a pillow is a place of rest. It's where we lay what we think, what we feel, what we dream. But Jacob had none of that. He only had a stone, and I wonder how many today sleep with hearts as hard as that pillow. How many lie down on guilt, memories, traumas, and choices that once felt right, but now weigh like rocks? Jacob lay down with fear, with remorse, with doubt, and God came down. Yes, came down. The Bible describes that he dreamed of a ladder, a connection between heaven and earth, angels going up and coming down, and at the top, the Lord. But what strikes me most in this passage isn't just the ladder. It's the fact that even as a deceiver, Jacob was visited. Even while running, he was reached. God presented himself with words that didn't condemn, but reaffirmed, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and of Isaac. I am with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back." That wasn't a rebuke. It was a rescue. Not a punishment, but an invitation. There, lying on a stone, Jacob saw the heavens open and discovered something that would change his journey forever. God doesn't bless based on performance. He reveals himself through grace. I, Eliam, feel this scene as an answer for someone who keeps trying to prove they still deserve to be used. Someone running from themselves, afraid that heaven has already given up. But hear this, even stone pillows can become altars, and even nights of fleeing can become portals to the beginning of a new identity. Jacob woke up startled and exclaimed, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it." That is one of the most honest lines in the Bible, because often God is there. Even when we don't feel him, even when we're wrong, even when we sleep on guilt, Jacob got up, took that same stone, anointed it with oil, and called the place Bethel, house of God. But the journey was still far from over. Jacob had stopped because he was tired, but also because he was desperate. He was alone, far from his family, carrying the blessing of a father he had deceived, running from the fury of a brother who had vowed to kill him. His body was on the ground, but his soul was suspended in a place where neither the past offered comfort nor the future seemed promising. It was as if everything he had done up until that moment had built a bridge to nowhere. It was night. The desert offered no shelter. His thoughts offered no rest. He lay down, not because he felt safe, but because he was exhausted. And he had no pillow, so he used what was nearby, a stone. That's the detail the Bible mentions, and one I can never ignore, because the stone represents much more than an improvised object. It is the exact figure of the emotional rigidity of a man who had lived trying to be something he was not, who had been shaped by adaptation, not by truth. Jacob's heart at that moment was as hard as the pillow he laid on, but it was on that kind of pillow that God chose to reveal himself. During sleep, Jacob had a dream. He saw a ladder that touched the earth and reached the heavens, and on it, angels of God were ascending and descending in a movement that seemed orchestrated by something far greater than he could ever comprehend. At the top of the ladder, a presence, not just any angelic figure or religious symbol, but the Lord himself. The vision was not just mystical, it was theological, it was spiritual, it was prophetic, and more than that, it was personal. God was not just showing a pathway between two worlds. He was declaring, without using those exact words, that the earth was still not disconnected from heaven, that even a man on the run could still be reached, that even one who had deceived could still be visited, and the divine message was direct, detailed, and surprising. God didn't mention the failure. He didn't mention Esau. He didn't demand explanations. He simply reaffirmed the promise he had made to Abraham and Isaac, but now directed to Jacob. The land where you are lying, I will give to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out in all directions. And through you and your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. God promises presence, I am with you. Promises protection, I will watch over you wherever you go. Promises restoration, I will bring you back to this land. And finally, promises faithfulness, I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. Now look, Jacob, who had taken the blessing through cunning, now receives a promise he doesn't need to steal. And that changes everything. And I can't read this part without a deep conviction in my spirit. There are many today who carry blessings they don't know how to enjoy because the way they obtained them still weighs on them. There are sons and daughters living in emotional flight. Men and women who heard promises but feel they ruined everything along the way. And for them, the ladder at Bethel is an eternal reminder. Heaven remains open, even when everything inside you feels closed. The ladder Jacob saw wasn't just a metaphor, it was a prophecy. Jesus, many centuries later, would make direct reference to this vision when, speaking to Nathanael, he declared that heaven would remain open, and the angels of God would ascend and descend upon the Son of Man. He was and is the bridge, the ladder, the access. Jacob didn't understand all of this in that moment, but he understood enough to know that the place was not ordinary. When he awoke, his first thought was a confession. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. One of the most honest statements in biblical history, because that's what happens when God shows up in the middle of guilt. You realize he was there the whole time, even when you thought you didn't deserve him. Jacob felt fear, reverence. He recognized the place as the house of God. There was no temple, no altar, no priest, but there was encounter. And where God reveals himself, the geography changes. Luz became Bethel, and the stone that had been a pillow became a pillar of covenant. What happened there didn't erase the past, but it laid the foundation for a redemptive future. God didn't cancel Jacob, God marked him. And that kind of mark never fades. Jacob had dreamed of heaven, but when he woke up, he was still the same man on the outside. Same clothes, same face, same name. The touch of the promise didn't change him instantly. It only began to press, from the inside out, what would later be transformed. He took the stone he had used as a pillow, set it up as a pillar, poured oil on it, and declared that the place was sacred. But instead of surrendering completely, he chose an in-between response. He made a vow. If the Lord will be with me and watch over me on this journey, and give me food to eat and clothes to wear, and bring me back safely to my father's house, Then the Lord will be my God. It's a conditional vow, immature, insecure, but still a beginning. Jacob wasn't saying he rejected God. He was saying he didn't yet know how to relate to him, because when your entire life has been built on strategies, human alliances, and emotional manipulation, the idea of a relationship based on pure trust feels far too risky. And this is the place where many people find themselves spiritually touched but not surrendered, visited but not yielded. They know God is speaking, but still live trying to negotiate, because surrendering control requires dying inside. But God is not offended by this kind of response. He understands the journey, and that's exactly why he chose to show up before demanding transformation. Because heaven doesn't wait for you to be ready to reveal itself. It comes down to where you are, with the promise of what you can still become. And I know what it's like to meet God in a place where I only expected guilt. I know what it's like to hear a promise when all I deserved was silence. And that's why I can say God doesn't begin with punishment. He begins with presence, because no one is transformed without first being visited. Jacob still had a long way to go. He still carried burdens, fears, unresolved emotional patterns. But now there was something the desert couldn't take from him: a word, a vision, a visitation. And when God visits a man, he marks time. The name, the story, the first block of Jacob's journey ends here. He is not yet Israel, but God already saw him as such. Because to heaven, true identity is not defined by the mistake made, but by the destiny established. Jacob continued on his way. His feet moved forward, but his soul was still stuck in Bethel. That ladder remained in his thoughts, as if the dream had left residue in the air, in his body, in his memory. He had been visited. Of that there was no doubt. But everything God had said that night still swirled inside him like a whirlwind, and it wasn't easy to believe. God had promised land, descendants, return, protection, universal blessing. But how do you believe in a blessing like that when all you feel is shame? Jacob had no fixed place. He was heading toward the house of Laban, a distant relative, trying to find a new beginning there. But the miles didn't erase the echoes of betrayal. He still remembered his father's eyes, Esau's pain, the heavy silence of the house where it all happened. And now, even with a divine promise in his bag, he walked like someone carrying a secret and a fear that everything he had heard could vanish at any moment. Jacob grew up learning that the most important things in life are not given, they're earned. And those who earn defend themselves. Those who defend themselves become suspicious. And those who are suspicious never truly surrender. So even after hearing God's voice, even after seeing heaven open, he didn't fully surrender. Not out of arrogance, but because his soul was still bound by the insecurity of someone who never knew what it meant to be loved without having to do something in return. That's why Jacob's journey must be read through the eyes of the soul, not just through the eyes of doctrine. Because there is a lot of faith trapped in traumas that traditional discipleship has never known how to deal with. Jacob didn't doubt God's existence. He doubted that a God so grand could truly choose someone like him. He saw the ladder, but still saw himself beneath it. He saw the angels, but didn't see himself as worthy of the mission. He heard eternal promises, but still felt too temporary to carry them. He didn't reject the calling, but he didn't run to obey either. His soul was still fragmented. Touched, yes, but healed, not yet. And it's in that state that he decides to make a vow. Jacob had no altar before him. There was no crowd, no priest to mediate, but he felt the need to respond to the spiritual experience he had. And in his own way, he did. He made a vow: if the Lord is with me, if he watches over me on this journey, if he gives me bread to eat and clothes to wear, if I return in peace to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. This statement is not just an expression of faith. It's an open window into the soul of a man who lived trying to earn everything he received. Jacob still didn't know how to relate to a God who offers covenant before obedience. He knew an inherited God, the God of his father, the God of his grandfather. But he didn't yet know what it meant to say, my God. So he tries to build that bridge. With conditions, it's not rebellion. It's immaturity. It's not unbelief. It's emotional insecurity. Jacob lists the basics: protection, provision, and a safe return. Simple things. But he puts them as conditions for recognizing the Lord as his God. That reveals something deep. He still doesn't understand that God's favor isn't negotiated with good behavior. He's still operating under the logic of merit. And that exposes how the wound of rejection shapes even the theology behind our vows. Because Jacob isn't saying this to bargain. He's saying it because deep down, he still believes God might change his mind, that the blessing might be taken back, that the promise might be revoked if he fails at any point. And this logic, unfortunately, is more common than it seems. And I, Eliam, know the weight of carrying a faith like that. I've seen sincere hearts lose their way trying to negotiate with a God who requires no negotiation. Good people hungry for God, but trapped in emotional pacts born from pain, not revelation. Jacob's vow hurts, not because it's heretical, but because it's real. Because it reveals a man who wants to believe, but is still afraid to trust. God heard him. And once again, he didn't interrupt. Heaven didn't step in to correct his theology, nor did it demand a perfect declaration of faith, because God knew exactly what he was about to do, not respond to the vow, but shape the man who made it. Jacob's prayer doesn't impress. But God is not looking for impressive prayers. He's looking for sincere hearts, even if broken. And that's exactly what Jacob was. His faith was raw. His requests were shallow. His understanding was limited. But there was a seed there, a beginning. A thread of relationship that, though fragile, was not fake. That is the difference between dead faith and faith in formation. The first doesn't respond even to the greatest miracles. The second trembles, hesitates, negotiates, but doesn't give up. Jacob still didn't see himself as part of the story God had begun with Abraham. He still felt outside the emotional lineage, even though he was inside the biological promise. But that confusion wouldn't push him away from God. It would become the very thing God would use to shape him, and the tool for that shaping had a name: Laban. I've seen this before. When God wants to deal with a Jacob, he sends him to live with someone who will make him feel, in the flesh, what he once made others feel. Not for revenge, but for pedagogical justice. Because before the name changes, the heart must see itself in the mirror, and so the deceiver walks into the arms of someone even more cunning than he is. If you've ever lived through Jacob's tension, of knowing you were visited by God, yet still feeling like you have to prove yourself, write in the comments, I trust even without understanding everything. Writing in faith is the first step to living it from the heart. And if this journey is speaking to you, don't forget to subscribe to the Shadows of Scripture channel. Here, every story doesn't just reveal the past. It confronts the present and prepares you for what's coming in the near future. The man who arrived in the land of Haran was no longer the same man who had left Beersheba. On the outside, Jacob carried only a promise and the fear of being recognized. On the inside, there was a field under renovation, cracks opened by guilt, divine words not yet absorbed, and a heart beginning to understand the cost of being called. He had encountered God at Bethel, but now he would face the cruelest mirror of his journey, a man named Laban. Laban was his uncle Rebekah's brother, but he wasn't just a distant relative. He was, so to speak, the matured version of everything Jacob had been up to that point: cunning, persuasive, practical, capable of manipulating with a smile on his face and sealing deals with hidden motives. A man who knew the value of people, not through affection, but through productivity. When Jacob arrived, he was well received. He found shelter, saw Rachel for the first time, and fell in love. But that brief moment of relief would soon turn into a new kind of captivity, emotional servitude. Jacob proposed a deal: 7 years of work in exchange for marrying Rachel. He didn't ask for shortcuts. He was willing to wait, And the sacred text says that those 7 years seemed like only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. But the wedding day came, and Laban deceived him. In the darkness of the tent on the night of the ceremony, Rachel was replaced by her older sister Leah. When morning came, Jacob realized it. The man who had deceived his father was now deceived by his father-in-law. What he had done with the blessing, he now experienced in marriage. What he had sown in deception, he reaped in intimacy. And this may have been the bitterest lesson so far. And here, I, Eliam, need to say something I feel with both sorrow and reverence. When God wants to heal someone who has wounded others through manipulation, he places them before someone who also knows how to manipulate. Not for revenge, but for redemption. Because there are wounds that can only be treated when you feel in your own skin what you caused in others. When Jacob confronts Laban, he hears a disarming reply. Here, it is not our custom to give the younger before the older. It wasn't just a tradition, it was a mirror. Laban had exposed an invisible structure that supported Jacob's soul. He had always wanted to reach ahead of his time. And now time imposed itself with a firm voice, but he accepted it. He made a new agreement. He would work 7 more years, not for merit, but for love, not for pleasure, but because he had no other way out. And that's how the deceiver began to be shaped. As a servant, 14 years. 14 years serving a man who gave him unstable promises, changing wages, exhausting tasks. Jacob was tested in silence. And the most painful part was that God was also silent. No new ladder, no new promise, no new vision. Just days and nights repeated. Planting, herding, negotiating. Love and tension between 2 wives. Children being born. Responsibilities growing. But the heart still waiting for something to confirm what he had seen at Bethel. This is the kind of season almost no one preaches about. The season when the promise is real, but heaven seems distant. When the blessing exists, but it comes with weight, sweat, and humiliation. Jacob learned to be silent, to wait, to obey. Not out of virtue, but out of exhaustion. What once was an instinct for control was now beginning to bend under the weight of reality. He could no longer force the timing. He could no longer manipulate the outcome. He simply had to endure, live, serve. And this kind of journey, though painful, begins to produce something that deception was never able to offer: character. Because when God allows someone to serve in silence for years, he's not punishing them. He's preparing them. Jacob didn't know it yet, but he was being shaped for a name that would demand more than cleverness. It would demand stability, and for that, he had to be broken. Not in the scandals, but in the backstage. Jacob served in a foreign land, living among a people who did not know the God of Abraham, submissive to a master who did not respect his destiny, married to 2 women who day after day embodied an emotionally irreconcilable tension. He was the father of many children, but had not yet reunited with the father of his youth. He worked for a living, rose early, slept late. But what stands out to me the most is that even in this context, God prospered him. Yes, he prospered him, but not in the way people expect. There were no crowns, no thrones, no public recognition. Jacob's prosperity came from the ground, from the flocks, from the ability to multiply little, from the wisdom gained in the weariness of routine, from the resilience born from years of not hearing the voice that once descended from heaven. He served and grew, silently, slowly, divinely, and that teaches us something crucial. God's promise does not depend on the territory. Jacob was outside of Canaan, outside of the promised land, but inside the will of God, because sometimes the path of faithfulness goes straight through uncomfortable lands, through exiles, through seasons that seem off-plan, but in heaven's eyes, they are precisely the places where character is forged. Laban exploited him, changed his wages, manipulated the terms, but none of that could stop the favor of God. On the contrary, it was against that kind of resistance that the blessing became most evident. Jacob began to prosper even when Laban tried to stop him. What should have gone wrong went right. What was supposed to be scarce multiplied. What looked unfair became fertile ground for faithfulness, but there's something even deeper. The prosperity Jacob experienced was not disconnected from the promise. It was the silent continuation of Bethel. God had not spoken again, but he had started to fulfill, and I feel that many today are living exactly in that stage. You no longer hear what you used to hear. You no longer feel what you used to feel. But when you look back, you realize something has blossomed while you obeyed. Faith, even silent, is bearing fruit. Faithfulness, even weary, is being honored. God is still working, even when he seems absent. Jacob didn't live in Canaan, but Canaan already lived in him. He already carried sons. He already kept the words. He already breathed the future. And more than that, he was already being repositioned for the next phase. Because there is a time when God plants us in exile, but there is also a time when he calls us back. Jacob had become a prosperous man, but not in the way he may have dreamed of in his youth. There was no apparent glory, no complete security, no sense of mission fulfilled. What he had was what many still fail to recognize as favor, partial peace amid weariness, growth in hostile ground, fruit harvested from a land that wasn't his. He hadn't returned to Canaan. He hadn't yet fulfilled his promise. He hadn't yet faced his past. But everything God had spoken at Bethel was already beginning to take form. Children, flocks, territory, experience, a mark. God had caused an identity to bloom. In strange soil, Jacob still didn't know his name would be changed. But his heart was no longer the same. He had spent 20 years away from the land he fled. 20 years serving the man who was his uncle, but also represented the worst version of himself. Laban wasn't just cunning, he was controlling, relentlessly unfair, and spiritually dull. For 2 decades, he changed wages, manipulated deals, used his daughters as leverage, and the herds as currency. Jacob didn't just work for him. He survived him, but God was with Jacob, and in time began to give him favor, even within the oppressive system. The herds began to grow. The children multiplied. Jacob's structure was no longer that of a servant, but of a patriarch. And over time, Laban began to see him as a threat, no longer as an ally. The relationship completely deteriorated. There was no more trust, only obligation and forced tolerance. That's when the tension reached its limit. And then God spoke. After so much silence, the Lord visited him with a clear instruction. Return to the land of your fathers and your relatives, and I will be with you. It was the end of a cycle. Leaving wouldn't be simple. There was an entire structure in place. Wives, children, servants, flocks, territory, unspoken agreements. Jacob had to make the decision without warning. And when Laban found out, he went after him, not just because of the loss, but because he couldn't accept losing control. The reunion was hostile. Laban questioned him, pressured him, tried to assert authority. But now Jacob was different. For the first time, he responded like someone who carries a calling. He spoke with firmness, recalled his story, exposed the abuse, refused to continue being exploited. And in doing so, he didn't just take a stand. He broke spiritually with that environment. Laban recognized he couldn't stop him. They made an agreement, set up a stone marker as a witness, and sealed the end of that alliance. Jacob was no longer a servant. Now he was responsible and free, but leaving there didn't mean rest. It meant walking toward the very thing that haunted him. After the final break with Laban, Jacob kept moving, not just geographically, but spiritually. For the first time in years, he was heading toward the place where it all began. But now, he had no more excuses, no one to blame, no victim role to hold on to. Exile was over, and what lay ahead was what he had tried to avoid his entire life: Esau. The way back home passed through the valley where he had left an angry brother, a weeping mother, and a deceived father. And even though he had prospered, even though God had been faithful, there was a wound that time hadn't healed, only covered. Jacob was marching with his entire caravan. Wives, children, servants, livestock, everything he had built outside the promised land. But what came next wasn't a new construction. It was a collision with the past. When he sent messengers to let Esau know he was coming, the reply came quickly and sharply. Esau is coming to meet you, and with him 400 men. That sentence broke him inside. He knew what it could mean. It didn't sound like a family visit. It didn't sound like a peaceful reunion. It sounded like an army. And in that moment, Jacob realized that all his external structure, wealth, authority, experience, wasn't enough to protect him from the guilt he still carried. He went into crisis mode. He split his family into two groups, thinking that if Esau attacked one, maybe the other could escape. He thought of gifts, thought of how to soften the impact, thought of everything, except running. Because now he couldn't run anymore. This is the point where the return home becomes a battlefield of the spirit. Not with Esau, but within himself. The past hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting for him to come back. Jacob had reached his limit. He had done everything he could as a man, divided the groups, prepared the gifts, organized the march. But deep inside, he couldn't escape an uncomfortable truth. All the fear he felt toward Esau was born from what still existed within him. Guilt, shame, doubt. The past hadn't died. It had only been sleeping, and now it returned with force. At that point he prayed. But it wasn't a prayer like before, full of deals and conditional promises. It was different. Now he knew he had nothing to offer, nothing to bargain with. He could only acknowledge, Lord, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. He remembered how it started. With only my staff, I crossed this Jordan. Now he stood there with wives, children, servants, flocks. But he understood, none of it made him more worthy. It all came from grace, he confessed. I am afraid Esau will come and kill me, and the mothers with the children. It was the first time he showed himself vulnerable before God without trying to control the outcome. He prayed because he needed to, because he no longer knew what else to do. Because this time there was no way to run, no way to manipulate, no way to delay. But even after the prayer, the anguish didn't go away. He sent gifts ahead to Esau. Maybe that would soften his brother's heart. Maybe not. He didn't know what to expect anymore. And that's exactly when something happened, something he chose to do. Jacob separated himself from everyone. He stepped away. He stayed alone. It was a deliberate decision. He wasn't just avoiding the confrontation. He was admitting he had reached his limit, that nothing else could be done by force, that the problem wasn't just Esau, it was him, and it was alone, facing the night, that he prepared for what would become the turning point of his life. The journey had brought him there. The pain had carried him to that point. Now, he was ready, not because he understood everything, but because he had nothing left to hold him up as before. And God, who had walked with him in silence for so many years, now drew near, not with a voice, but with a fight. This is where the running ends, and the definitive confrontation begins, with the God who had called him from the womb. Night fell, and with it came the moment no amount of preparation could avoid. Jacob had crossed the Jabbok River with his family and possessions, but afterward, he went back. He chose to stay behind, alone. It was a conscious decision. He wasn't left behind. He withdrew, not because everything was resolved, but because he knew nothing else could be resolved externally. He had reached a point where the only thing that needed to happen had to happen inside him, and it is in that kind of silence that God works. There was no audience, no voice from heaven, no ladder, no dream, no promise. There was only a man on the edge of exhaustion, a man who no longer wanted to run, but also didn't know how to move forward. What he would face in the next few hours wouldn't be Esau. It would be God himself. But before the fight began, came the emptying, and I, Eliam, believe this is the point where many stop, because they want change but not solitude. They want revelation but not silence. They want a new name, but not to let go of the old identity. Jacob didn't ask to fight, but God knew that in that condition he couldn't carry the promise into the future. Not the way he was, so in that place, the invisible became tangible. Someone approached, not to speak, but to grab. During the night, someone came close to Jacob and attacked him. There was no conversation, no explanation. The fight began immediately, hand to hand, without warning. Jacob didn't know who he was wrestling with, but he fought back. He had spent his whole life defending himself. From the womb, he was used to fighting for space. Now was no different. What he knew how to do was resist. So he resisted. The struggle was long. Neither one overpowered the other. There were no pauses, no time to think. It was pure physical effort. Time passed, and the opponent didn't retreat. And Jacob wouldn't give in either. There are no details about the exact location or how the fight began. All we know is that it lasted the whole night. And that Jacob didn't run. He didn't flee. He faced it. Why didn't he let go? Because deep down, even without fully understanding it, he knew this was more than a regular fight. There was something different about it. When dawn came, the man tried to leave. Jacob held on. He didn't want that to end without an answer. After everything he had lived through, he couldn't bear to walk away the same. And he said, "I won't let you go unless you bless me." It was direct, without theological explanation, without unnecessary emotion. He wanted something that would mark him, something that confirmed this fight wasn't in vain. Jacob held on. The man had already tried to pull away, but he wouldn't allow it. It was at that moment that his opponent touched Jacob's hip and dislocated it. It was a precise move. Not a blow, not a wild attack. A touch with authority, enough to cause immediate pain and make it impossible to continue the fight on equal terms. Jacob's physical strength ended right there. He could no longer fight, only lean. But even limping, he didn't let go. It was the final breaking of self-sufficiency. Jacob had already separated from the camp, already faced his fear, already prayed. But he was still trying to resolve everything his own way, through resistance, effort, and persistence. The touch on the hip ended that phase. It wasn't punishment. It was correction. It was the visible mark that the fight had a greater purpose than winning or losing. It was about transformation. From that moment on, Jacob would never walk the same again. Physically, he was marked. Spiritually, too. The pain served as a breaking point. God wasn't just wrestling with him. He was ending a cycle. The man who walked away from the Jabbok was not the same man who had entered alone. Jacob gave a name to the place where it all happened. He called it Peniel. According to him, it was because he had seen God face to face, and yet was still alive. He walked away limping. His hip had been struck. That injury became permanent. There were no explanations after the fight. No words from God, no new instructions. Jacob returned to camp alone. The only thing that had changed was his name. He was now called Israel. The name Israel was given to Jacob after the fight. According to the biblical text, its meaning is tied to the phrase, "Because you have wrestled with God and with men and have prevailed." This name marks a transition. Until then, Jacob was known for a history of deception, fleeing, and manipulation. From here on, his identity is tied to endurance in the face of difficult situations, especially with God. Israel doesn't just mean that he won. It means he went through confrontation with God and wasn't destroyed. And that changes the kind of responsibility he carries. He's no longer just the son of Isaac. Now his name becomes the name of a people. The name he receives will go on to designate an entire nation. The name change wasn't just a correction of identity. It was a reorientation of purpose. Jacob until now had lived to ensure his own survival. He deceived to be chosen, fled to preserve his life, worked to secure space. Everything he did, even when God was with him, was focused on protecting his own story. But upon receiving the name Israel, that logic is broken. God's promise, since Abraham involved descendants, territory, and blessing over nations. That promise passed through Isaac, reached Jacob, and now it's being reaffirmed on a different foundation. Jacob is no longer just someone who carries the promise. Now he becomes the structure of a nation. 12 sons. Each one will give rise to a tribe. What he does from this point on won't affect just his own life. It will affect the history of God's people. He's no longer just a receiver of the blessing. He becomes a transmitter, and I, Eliam, affirm this is where many people fail. They want transformation, but keep living only for themselves. Israel isn't just a new name. It's a new responsibility. The focus shifts from self to others, from personal protection to collective purpose. The moment Jacob had feared most, his entire life had finally arrived. He no longer had control over anything. Esau was coming, and with him 400 men. There was no way to predict what would happen. Jacob had no army, no protection, no guarantees, only the memory of a past built on deception. And the consequences of that past were now coming to meet him. He organized his wives and children into groups. But when the time came, he didn't hide behind anyone. He was the one who stepped forward, alone, limping from the fight the night before. Each step hurt. But it wasn't the physical pain that weighed the most. It was the burden of years without resolution, without forgiveness, without reconciliation. Jacob approached Esau, and without saying a word, he bowed once, then again, 7 times in total. That gesture said everything. I recognize what I did. I have nothing to demand, and I'm not here to fight. This wasn't the same man who had deceived his brother and run away. He wasn't trying to convince, manipulate, or argue. For the first time, he just wanted to be honest. Esau, who had every reason to come with vengeance, responded in an unexpected way. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't give a speech. He ran to his brother and embraced him. The scene is simple, but it carries enormous weight. 2 men marked by history, by pain, and by distance were now in the same field, not to repeat the past, but to close a chapter that had never been resolved. Jacob wept. And it wasn't weakness. It was the end of a war he himself had started and carried for decades. He insisted that Esau accept the gifts as a way to make up for years of guilt. And he said, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God," because days earlier in Peniel, he had survived a divine encounter. Now he survived the human one he had avoided all his life. That meeting didn't erase everything that had happened, but it marked that he didn't have to continue being the same man. Jacob didn't return to become Esau's friend. They didn't walk together after that. But he did what needed to be done. He faced the one he had hurt and presented himself as someone who had been changed. After reuniting with Esau, Jacob didn't immediately return to the place God had told him to go. He went to Succoth, built shelters, set up camp, and once again settled where it was convenient, not where he had been called. Later, he chose to stop in Shechem. He bought land, settled there with his family, but that was not the place of promise. Soon, the seemingly safe environment became the scene of tragedy. His daughter Dinah was violated. His sons responded with vengeance, murdering the men of the city. Jacob's name became entangled in scandal. The structure he had tried to build outside of God's direction began to collapse. It was in that context that God spoke again with clarity. "Arise, go up to Bethel and settle there." Bethel wasn't just a geographic location. It was the place where Jacob had first met God as a young man, fleeing from his parents' house. It was there he saw the ladder, received a promise, and made a conditional vow. Now, years later, God was calling him back to the point of origin, not to relive the past, but to solidify his new identity. Jacob didn't hesitate. He told everyone to remove the foreign gods, to purify themselves, change their clothes, and get ready. He understood that you can't go up just any way. It wasn't just about geography, it was about spiritual posture. When he arrived at Bethel, Jacob built an altar. Unlike the first time, he wasn't bargaining. He didn't make demands or tie God's faithfulness to results. Now he recognized who God is, regardless of what he receives. God appeared again and repeated what he had said before. "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Israel will be your name." This was the end of the transition process. Israel's identity was now confirmed. Before his household, before God, and before the mission he now had to carry, Israel stayed in Bethel for a time. The altar was built. The new identity was confirmed. But life went on, and with it the scars of the journey began to show. The Bible records that Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died during that time. Soon after, Rachel also died while giving birth to Benjamin. Jacob buried the woman he had loved the most. Later, he also lost Isaac, heavy losses. One after another, he was no longer living as a fugitive, but now he faced pain as a man who carried promises and responsibilities. And that required stability, not escape. The spiritual marks of his encounter with God were still on Jacob's body. He was still limping. There was no physical healing, but now that was no longer a weakness. It was a reminder that he had been confronted, exposed, and transformed. And unlike before, he wasn't trying to hide it. His story was visible, and the altar he built marked exactly that he had been broken by God, and that this breaking had made him ready to carry a name that no longer belonged only to him, but to the entire people who would come after him. Israel's spirituality wasn't based on speeches or mystical experiences. It was built on scars, on loss, on real confrontations with the past and with God, and that placed him in a different position, not as someone better, but as someone ready to serve as a foundation. The 12 tribes didn't come from a hero. They came from a man who took hits from life, who wrestled with God, who carried scars, and who finally understood that to be used by God is not to have control. It is to surrender. If this word spoke to you, leave a comment. Lord, I receive the name that comes from your will. That kind of surrender is what changes the direction of the journey. And take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now. Here, every piece of content is designed to root you in truth, activate your faith, and prepare you to live what God truly has for you. If you haven't liked the video yet, go ahead and hit the like button now, and share it with someone who needs to understand that identity isn't something we choose. It's something God reveals. Remember, God doesn't change names to make us look better. He changes them to make us useful. See you in the next video.